They didn't just tear it down, they erased it as if it had never existed. The wild roses were crushed, the stone chimney reduced to rubble, and where Elias Monroe's cabin once stood was now nothing but churned earth and diesel-soaked silence. And as he stood there, eyes fixed on the destruction, the former Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court made one quiet promise: they were going to regret underestimating him. They came for the roses first. Not with shears or clippers, but with a notice crisp, accusatory, and utterly absurd. It had been taped to the wrought iron gate. Elias Monroe had restored himself, the ink already beginning to smudge from the morning dew. Non-compliant vegetation violation, it read, citing unapproved wild flora, disrupting community aesthetics. He held the paper in one hand, a ceramic mug of black coffee in the other, and looked past the gate to where the climbing heirloom roses, some over 50 years old, tangled romantically up the stone wall of his family's cabin. They bloomed defiantly in shades of crimson and dusty pink, completely unaware they had committed a crime. At 61, Elias had hoped to spend his retirement in this slice of the mountainside. The cabin had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now him. A modest A-frame with cedar siding, weathered to the soft gray of old driftwood, its roof sagged slightly at the center beam, and the stone fireplace leaned just a hair left. But it was perfect. It was peace. After 4 decades in the justice system, most recently as Chief Justice of the state's Supreme Court, Elias had traded courtrooms and headlines for hummingbirds trail hikes and the laughter of his granddaughter on summer weekends. Rosebriar Heights Community Association didn't exist when he first bought the land under his own name, long before the boutique development spilled up the valley behind him. And when they held their first welcome orientation for adjacent landowners, Elias had attended out of politeness, not obligation. That was when he met her Celeste Duval, 58 HOA president, rose cultivator, and absolute monarch of every blade of grass within Rosebriar's gates. Her reputation preceded her like perfume. They called her the Iron Orchid, a woman who could prune you with a glance and cite zoning bylaws from memory. Her garden had once won a regional magazine feature, and she mentioned it subtly or not in every conversation since. Celeste had introduced herself with a smile that felt more like a barcode scan. Her hair, a steel-capped helmet of platinum blonde, didn't move in the breeze, and her Range Rover never bore so much as a speck of dirt. Judge Monroe, she'd said in that syrupy southern lilt polished sharp enough to slice fruit. Welcome to the Rosebriar family. We take great pride in our community identity. And your property? Her eyes flicked up to the cabin nestled in the pines has such potential to support that identity. That first meeting ended with a thinly veiled request, a suggestion she said about placing a floral-themed Rosebriar welcome sign just on the edge of his land to enhance the aesthetics of the newly planned community trail. Elias had smiled ever the diplomat and replied that he would consider the request provided he could review the design placement and ensure it didn't imply public access to his private land. Celeste had nodded, her expression unreadable. Of course, we're all about harmony and mutual respect. He should have known better. The signed proposal returned 2 weeks later as a sketch depicting his actual cabin, not the tree line, not the gravel drive, but the cabin itself, labeled in looping script, Future Rosebriar Guest Annex. The attached letter was festooned with ivy-printed borders and dripping with condescension. Celeste wrote of community goodwill, the underutilized nature of his lovely cabin, and how ideal it would be for hosting prospective homeowners, overflow guests during HOA events, and occasional dignitaries. She even offered a stipend for light cleaning, as if Elias Monroe had spent his life interpreting the Constitution only to mop floors for weekenders. He replied with a short formal letter: "The property known as Parcel 12B is private and will remain so. It is not available for community access, shared use, or structural reassignment. I trust this resolves the matter." It didn't. What followed was a slow, deliberate campaign of petty tyranny. Violation letters arrived weekly, one for the vintage mailbox that did not conform to the approved Rosebriar standard, another for the cabin's gray cedar siding that was out of palette. A particularly spiteful notice condemned the handmade birdhouse his granddaughter had painted for him as unpermitted accessory structure. Celeste never showed anger. She was polite always. The notes were wrapped in passive aggression and calligraphy. Elias began documenting everything. He pulled his original property deeds, had the boundaries resurveyed by a county official, and compared the results to the plat maps Rosebriar submitted during their incorporation. His land was not only outside their borders, it had been grandfathered in under a separate zoning designation, free from their covenants, restrictions, or self-declared authority. But facts meant nothing to Celeste Duval. To her, HOA influence flowed like creeping ivy over fences, across lines uninvited and unrepentant. Then came the hospitality schedule. He received it via email, a spreadsheet. It listed weekends for guest turnover occupancy estimates, 2 to 5 adults light luggage, and most stunningly, a column labeled host duties, where Elias was expected to provide linens, restock the pantry, and prepare 2 home-cooked meals weekly. Suggested menus were attached alongside a charming bullet point local cuisine preferred. Reimbursement for ingredients, negotiable max $15 head. The audacity was breathtaking. It was as if his home was no longer his, but a line item in Celeste's HOA fantasy camp. His response was sharp, legal, and final. He printed it, signed it, and sent it by certified mail to the HOA address and to Celeste personally. It included highlighted property statutes, the county survey, and a warning that any unauthorized entry would be treated as trespassing. Celeste's reply came not on paper but in the form of a manila envelope slid under his cabin door. Notice of intent to beautify non-compliant structure. Phase 1, site preparation. The language was vague but threatening. In the absence of homeowner cooperation, Rosebriar Heights reserves the right to pursue landscape harmonization efforts in the interest of community safety, cohesion, and aesthetics. Elias stared at the words for a long time. He had spent decades interpreting law, defending rights, and upholding due process. But never had he seen such weaponized pettiness, cloaked in community spirit and wielded like a hedge trimmer. He issued one final warning, this time through his attorney, again asserting his rights, legal protections, and the full weight of the documentation, proving the HOA had no jurisdiction. He hoped that would be enough. But as he stood that morning in his flannel shirt, coffee going cold, looking down at the notice taped to his gate, he understood something else. This wasn't about flowers or paint colors. This was about control. Celeste saw his independence, his roses, his quiet retreat as a crack in the pristine porcelain of her rule. And like any authoritarian in pearls, she would not allow the crack to spread. He took one last look at the roses that had survived 3 generations of weather fire season deer and the occasional overzealous squirrel, and made a silent promise to them. They would not go quietly, and neither would he. 3 days. That was the margin she gave him, the space between her ultimatum and her plan to erase history. Elias Monroe had not slept much since the envelope marked Phase 1 site preparation arrived like a death knell beneath his cabin door. He had responded with calm force, as was his habit, a formal warning, a certified letter, the exact legal language to spell out criminal trespass and civil liability. And yet a gnawing unease had grown in his chest, a tightness that didn't release even with the strong coffee or the cold morning air. On the 3rd morning he made the drive. He told no one. No sheriff, no attorney, no friend. Just himself and his worn-out truck, humming along the cracked roads that wound through the forest, a route he knew so well he could drive it blind. But nothing in his life prepared him for what he would find when he rounded the bend and stepped out beneath the whispering pines. The cabin was gone. Not damaged, not vandalized. Gone. In its place was raw, churned earth, a wound in the land where the foundation had once rested. The roses were crushed, ripped up at the roots. The porch swing, his granddaughter's favorite, lay in a heap of twisted chain and splintered wood. The fireplace stones, once the heart of that sanctuary, were scattered like bones. Diesel hung in the air, acrid and heavy, and in the center of it all bulldozer tracks dug deep into the soft earth like scars. Elias couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. He dropped to one knee, his hand trembling as it touched the dirt where his grandfather's hand-carved mantle once stood. A crushed photograph, half buried, showed him in younger years holding a trout beside his father, both men grinning in flannel shirts by the chimney that was now rubble. It was grief, yes, but it was something colder too. It was violation. This wasn't just personal. This was unlawful, unpermitted, and deliberate. And Celeste Duval, the Iron Orchid, had signed her name to it with a smile. He stood slowly, pulled his phone from his pocket, and began filming. Every track, every splinter, every broken piece of glass. He narrated in a low, steady voice, time-stamping the footage. He documented everything not as a man in mourning, but as a jurist preparing his case. Then he turned and walked back to the truck. The forest, once a place of peace, now rang with quiet fury. It was time. Within the hour, his voice had changed. Gone was the softness of retirement. Gone was the careful restraint. Elias Monroe, former Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, activated the full force of everything he had once commanded. His first call was to Janine Clark, former clerk of the court, now Chief of Staff to the Attorney General. "I need a full multi-agency probe into the Rosebriar Heights Community Association," he said calmly. "Find out if there was a permit filed for a demolition on Parcel 12B. There won't be. Pull financials, board minutes, corporate filings, and get me the county sheriff. This was criminal destruction of private property." Within 24 hours, subpoenas were drafted. Within 48, state auditors were reviewing public records. Elias stayed silent publicly. He gave no interviews, issued no press statements. He wanted their first reaction to be honest, untainted by fear of his name. That reaction came quickly. The contractor one, Vincent Big Vin Torelli, folded within an hour of questioning. He had been paid in cash through a slush fund labeled the Community Bloom Fund and shown what he thought were HOA-approved demolition papers signed by Celeste herself. She had told him it was an abandoned structure deemed unsafe. No permit, no inspection, no court order. Just her word. That was enough for now. The financial trail revealed even more. The Bloom Fund, a so-called emergency landscaping reserve, had been Celeste's private piggy bank. HOA fees diverted without member approval paid for the demolition, but also for spa visits, designer handbags, and suspicious consulting fees funneled into a company under her husband's name. A company that had no website, no office, and had filed no taxes in 3 years. As the investigation deepened, something remarkable began to happen. The silence broke. One by one, Rosebriar residents began to speak. A retired school teacher shared letters from Celeste threatening to remove her beloved rose arbor for spreading into common airspace. A young couple with an autistic son revealed they'd been fined repeatedly for disruptive behavior during meltdowns. A landscaper showed pictures of native wildflowers ripped from a homeowner's front yard and replaced with HOA-mandated rose bushes sourced from Celeste's personal nursery. Fear had kept them quiet. Elias's cabin being destroyed had awakened something else: rage. The momentum grew. The county planning office confirmed no demolition permit had ever been filed for Parcel 12B. The forged meeting minutes authorizing emergency action couldn't be verified by half the board. 2 members now facing perjury charges quietly sought immunity. Even Celeste's husband, Howard Duvall, broke under pressure. In an off-the-record confession, he admitted the consulting firm had never done real work. It had simply been a funnel. "She wanted total control," he said, pale and shaking. "She said the judge was standing in the way of her master plan. Said the cabin made us look backward." Meanwhile, Elias remained unseen. He monitored progress, offered guidance through Janine, and prepared his return. Not as a victim, not as a neighbor, but as a man who had seen justice weaponized and knew exactly how to take it back. Celeste, oblivious to the scale of what she had unleashed, doubled down. She sent out HOA newsletters referring to the incident as community-led beautification. She framed Elias as a recluse unwilling to participate in neighborhood harmony. She scheduled a community rally at the HOA clubhouse, standing beneath a banner that read, "Progress for Rosebriar." She didn't know subpoenas had already been served, that state investigators were auditing her books, that the sheriff's department had a file thicker than her garden club photo album. But she would know. Soon, one of Elias's former law clerks, now working for the Attorney General, nicknamed the process Operation Magnolia Hammer. It stuck. Because while the Iron Orchid thought herself untouchable, she had never met the quiet power of a magnolia in bloom. It was elegance with roots, grace with strength, and when it dropped its petals, it left nothing behind. The trap was closing, and the woman who had raised a legacy with arrogance and impunity was about to find out exactly what justice looked like when it grew thorns. The trap was closing, and Celeste Duvall didn't even hear the snap of the jaws. While she pruned roses and smiled in HOA newsletters, Elias Monroe moved quietly through the corridors of justice, assembling what could only be described as a legal sledgehammer, dressed in magnolia petals. Operation Magnolia Hammer, once just a nickname among state auditors, had now become a full-fledged task force. Elias watched it unfold from a distance, allowing the investigation to breathe, to grow, and most importantly, to catch Celeste in the purest state of arrogance, unguarded. It had taken less than 3 weeks to build a case that most prosecutors would kill to deliver. Elias had instructed everyone involved to keep his name buried until the exact moment it would matter most. He wanted her to look into the eyes of the man she thought she could crush and realize too late that he had never been powerless. And now the moment had arrived. The North Creek County Civic Auditorium was packed to capacity. Residents filled every seat. Local journalists lined the back wall, their cameras rolling. Subpoenaed HOA board members sat in stiff-backed chairs near the front, some nervously tapping their shoes, others whispering, trying not to appear as culpable as they felt. And at the center of it all, wearing a floral blouse and a practiced smile, sat Celeste Duval, the Iron Orchid, looking like a queen awaiting coronation, not judgment. She had no idea. The podium lights dimmed, and out stepped Margot Lane, lead prosecutor from the State Attorney General's office. She was composed, direct, and absolutely lethal in her delivery. Her voice, clear and clipped, began with what sounded like a benign introduction until it didn't. Today, she said, we are here to address a catastrophic failure of governance, of ethics, and of basic human decency, committed under the flag of a neighborhood association that has acted as a private fiefdom rather than a community steward. The first gasp came when she presented the work order signed in Celeste's looping cursive, authorizing the destruction of the derelict structure on Parcel 12B, a cabin that, according to official county maps displayed behind her on a massive screen, lay outside the legal boundaries of Rosebriar Heights. There was no permit, Margot continued, no safety inspection, no court ruling. This was not a beautification effort. This was a criminal act of trespass and destruction. Celeste's smile faltered. Her fingers began to twitch. But Margot wasn't done. She clicked a remote, and the next slide displayed financial records, detailed entries from the so-called Community Bloom Fund. Here, she said, you'll see payments for a demolition company called Floral Edge Services. That company, upon investigation, is a shell entity registered to Mr. Howard Duval, Celeste's husband, whose tax filings show no legitimate business activity. Whispers rippled through the room like wind through leaves. Other payments include luxury vehicle detailing, boutique purchases from high-end retailers, and consulting fees, all routed through HOA funds billed as neighborhood enhancements. These funds came from homeowner dues, and not one expense was approved by board vote or public record. Celeste now sat bolt upright, her postured, defensive eyes darting from side to side. Still, she held her tongue. Margot Lane turned the knife. What we are dealing with, she said, is embezzlement, wire fraud, falsification of public records, criminal destruction of private property, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The board members who signed forged minutes will be dealt with separately. But the architect of this scheme, she paused, turning toward Celeste, is sitting right here. Celeste stood abruptly. This is slanderous, she shouted. I have served this community with honor. That man's cabin was an eyesore, a hazard. I did what was necessary to preserve our values, our property values. Her voice was shrill, now frantic. And who even is he? Just some old man hiding in the woods. Margot Lane turned calmly to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, perhaps now is the time to hear from that old man. A silence fell over the room as a figure rose from the back row. Elias Monroe, dressed in a charcoal gray suit with no tie, walked slowly, deliberately down the center aisle. A few residents recognized him. A few more whispered his name. Celeste's mouth opened slightly, her eyes narrowed, trying to place him. Then Margot's voice rang out one final time. Allow me to reintroduce the owner of the former cabin on Parcel 12B, the Honorable Elias Monroe, retired Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. The room erupted in stunned silence. A breathless, heavy stillness overtook even the reporters. Celeste visibly paled, her entire body stiff with realization. Elias reached the front, nodded to Margot, then took the microphone. His voice was calm, but beneath it ran a current of iron. I lived quietly, he began. I paid my taxes, maintained my property, respected my neighbors. The cabin you destroyed was built by my grandfather's hands with tools passed down like heirlooms. It was not an eyesore. It was history. It was home. He turned to the room. When Celeste Duval's HOA decided they wanted it, they didn't knock. They didn't ask. They bulldozed it. And they did it under the banner of community while siphoning your money, violating your rights, and assuming you would never stand up. He paused, letting that settle. HOAs were meant to protect and serve. But when they become monarchies, when power consolidates and hides behind garden bylaws and floral rhetoric, they become dangerous. That's what happened here. And I assure you, it will not stand. From behind murmurs of approval turned into light applause. A woman in the third row, a widow who had once received her own violation notice for growing sunflowers, began to cry. Elias stepped back. Margot Lane raised her voice again. With the cooperation of the state, Rosebriar Heights Community Association is being placed under immediate receivership. A financial trustee will manage all funds. New elections will be held under court supervision. All board activity will be subject to external audit. Furthermore, today we are filing formal charges against Celeste Duval, Howard Duval, and 2 sitting board members for multiple felony counts. At the signal of the lead investigator, 2 uniformed deputies stepped forward. Celeste tried to protest, but her voice cracked and fell apart. Her husband, Ghost White, didn't resist. As the cuffs clicked around her wrist, she shouted again, "This is political. You're all sheep. This was for the good of the neighborhood." But no one was listening anymore. The roses she once controlled now bloomed in silent rebellion. In the months that followed, the HOA was rebuilt from the ground up. New leadership emerged, residents who cared about fairness, not image. The stolen funds were recovered and reinvested, and most importantly, Elias returned to his land. He rebuilt the cabin exactly as it was, from photographs, memory, and salvaged stone. The fireplace still leaned a little to the left, and the wild roses climbed eagerly over the new walls as if they knew. The story gained traction statewide. Elias met with legislators. Together, they drafted the Community Homeowner Protection Act, a sweeping bill enforcing transparency, limiting HOA overreach, and protecting individual property rights with real legal backing. It passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. For many, it became known not by its official title, but simply as the Monroe Law. Elias never returned to public office. He didn't need to. His rose garden, once nearly destroyed by power and pride, now thrived again, and each season it opened not to tourists, but to students, veterans, and neighbors. By invitation, by respect, not by force. And as he stood one evening watching the sun bleed gold across the ridge, he smiled. Because justice, like a rose, blooms best in the soil of truth, and some gardens are worth defending no matter the cost. Sometimes the battles that find us aren't the ones we chose, but they're the ones that reveal who we truly are. Elias Monroe never set out to become a symbol. He wanted quiet solitude and the scent of roses in the morning. But when injustice tore through his sanctuary, when power was abused under the name of community, he didn't run from the fight. He stood his ground. Not with rage, not with chaos, but with calm, precise action rooted in truth and law. The lesson here is powerful. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never assume that someone's humility is the same as helplessness. In a world where small authorities often try to wield oversized power, it's easy to feel outnumbered or unheard. But justice, when patiently pursued, has deep roots like Elias's roses. And no matter how aggressively someone tries to rip those roots out, truth has a way of blooming back stronger. This story also reminds us of the importance of knowing your rights, standing firm in the face of intimidation, and documenting everything. Elias didn't win because he shouted the loudest. He won because he stayed calm, built his case, and trusted in the systems that protect our freedoms. Whether you live in a HOA-controlled neighborhood or a small town, never let anyone bully you off your rightful land or silence your voice under the guise of order. And to those who lead, power is a responsibility, not a weapon. When leadership becomes about control instead of care, it poisons the very roots of community. The downfall of Celeste Duval wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And it's a reminder that even the most manicured facades can hide deep corruption if left unchecked. From all of us at US Justice Story, thank you for watching and listening. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of someone who's been wronged, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Your stories matter, your voice matters. And together we can shine a light on the everyday injustices that too often go unseen. This was more than a story about a cabin. It was a story about standing tall, digging deep, and letting truth take root. Until next time, stay strong, stay informed, and remember, justice doesn't always roar. It often arrives in silence and grows like a rose.